Judging from what has been said thus far, this symposium may well have been entitled Two Unknown Philosophers. My contribution will be to claim most likely they are unknowable. By a liberal, I mean someone who recognizes human misery as misery and believes that societies ought to, in organized ways, to strive to alleviate it. Being melioristic rather than utopian, liberals believe that misery can only be alleviated but never eradicated. This is the sense of liberalism dominant in American politics in the last century. This is the sense in which Dewey was a liberal. Was James a liberal? He certainly was melioristic and not utopian, at times saved from espousing utopian schemes by doses of skeptical common sense. But did he recognize misery as misery and believe in public action, or did he confine himself to private philanthropy with no particular social program? I think that James, in the last decade of his life, more or less the last decade, was moving towards liberalism, and he would have become one had he lived substantially longer. But liberalism never became for him, as it did for Dewey, a definite espoused program of social action. Thus, I would like to see a probing, investigative biography uncovering what James saw and what he did not see of the social problems around him. Given my own background, I've been especially struck that he was almost totally unaware of immigrants, a social process that was at that time transforming the United States. I would like a biography uncovering what he saw and what he did not see of the problems around him and how he reacted to them. Unfortunately, I'm not confident that this biography can ever be written. There are simply too many gaps in our knowledge. In his early years, I think James tended to respond to human misery in aesthetic terms. I have been struck by how often he used the word picturesque to characterize his take of the world, thereby insulating himself from nasty social realities, much as we at times insulate ourselves by seeing misery as something exotic. For example, in 1905, he writes from Naples, "The street floor composed of cave-like shops, the people doing their work on chairs in the street for the sake of their light. Such light and shade and grease and grime and swarm and apparent amiability would be hard to match. I have come here too late in life," I'm still quoting, "when the picturesque has lost its serious reality. Time was when hunger for it haunted me like a passion." Clearly, not the take of a liberal reformer. Or consider the following text much earlier from 1874 when he was in Rome. "Yesterday," I'm quoting, "I walked through the ghetto, Jews' quarter, and saw doré outdoorayed. The whole fat, greasy population out of their doors and windows, squatting all along the sides of their houses just like maggots on a piece of flesh." I do not think this anti-Semitism, as sometimes has been suggested, but simply perhaps an exuberant and over-vivid description of a picturesque scene. A slightly earlier text in the same spirit, "They live on almost nothing and are contented with that. and the great broad smile of everyone when spoken to. Clearly not the words of a man dominated by a social conscience. This particular image brings to mind illustrations in mid-19th century slavery apologetics of happy dancing darkies. Very similar theme. But there are indications that late in his life, in his last decade, he was moving from aesthetic response to a liberal response. Here I will focus on two incidents which could be very revealing if we knew more about them, but which most likely are going to remain problems, questions, rather than definite answers. In the year 1900, William McIntyre Salter, James's brother-in-law, proposed to adopt a child. James strongly objected on grounds that children were a burden and would interfere with Salter's public mission. Salter was an ethical culture leader, a movement for which James had considerable sympathy, a kind of secular clergyman. But in James's letter, there's one sentence which could mean little or could mean a great deal. And in the absence of information, I cannot tell you which. The sentence is as follows. Salter's present vocation of public devotion is a far wider ideal than the salvation of any one infant. The problem is this. Surely, James must have known that Salter was active in the Indian Rights Association, which worked for the assimilation of Indians by removing children from their families for adoption by whites. The Salter infant was a Native American. It is thus not clear what James means by saving one infant. Does he really believe that these infants, by being removed from their culture, were being saved? Or is he merely avoiding family quarrels by not raising broader social issues and pretending that his only concern is the welfare, the well-being of the Salters? James's objections, which he raised in his letter, were not well received by the family. Tradition in the Salter family holds that the adoption was not a happy one, but that the boy's relations with James were good, and that the two discussed metaphysics in Chikora. I believe the adopted son's son or grandson, I'm sorry, I can't remember which, told me about this and described the room. He's now in the American Midwest. His room is decorated with Sioux Indian memorabilia. His ancestor was not a Sioux, from a New England tribe, but he's trying to reclaim what that adopted boy lost. And he's talking with me on the telephone and describing what is on the walls of the room he is in. James lived during the era of the final defeat of the Indian nations. The massacre at Wounded Knee took place in 1890, almost at the same time as James published the Principles of Psychology. It is noteworthy that there are no references in his letters or writings to any of these events. But his later romantic sympathy for native cultures, evident in his objections to American imperialism in the Philippines, and his claim that bigness as such is an evil, suggests that he would not have approved of assimilationist policies, of the sort of policies followed by the Indian Rights Association, and of which that adoption was an instance. My second example James's last decade coincides with the gestation days of the modern civil rights movement. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was founded in 1910, several months after James's death. The first president was Moorfield Story, James's friend and informant on race matters as its first president. It's recorded in the letters that during one Boston campaign, the two went to a black church in South Boston. By 1909, James was aware that the race problem was more than a problem of individual philanthropy or a problem of law and order. He was aware of the different programs proposed by Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois and thought that both of these programs were needed. In this context, there is one incident which could be revealing if we knew more about it. In 1904, in Tallahassee, Florida, he visited what was then called the Florida Agricultural and Mechanical College for Negroes, and was prevailed upon to make a short address. Interestingly, he refused to speak at the white Florida State College and was much more favorably impressed by the black school and the general sense in this black school. Part of his response was clearly aesthetic. I'm quoting a phrase from one of his letters: opaque black faces hiding heaven knows what souls. But I have not been able to find any clues as to what he told his black audience. Did he content himself with social pleasantries and anecdotes about riding in the same carriage with Booker Washington? Or did he express some views about voting rights for blacks? By 1909, he's aware that this is a problem. This is 5 years earlier, so he might well have been aware, because of the links with Moorfield's story, that was a problem. He was aware that the college was modeled after Booker Washington's Tuskegee. But I do not know whether he used this opportunity to express at least the germ of a social program. It is for these reasons that I would like to see an investigative, probing biography, but doubt that one will ever be written. Thank you.